In 2010, fishermen found a private jet at the bottom of the ocean. It had been missing since 1998. For 12 years, it was a ghost story, a modern myth whispered among the elite. A jet full of their brightest children had simply vanished from the sky on a clear summer night. Now, it was a wreck, tangled in a reef nearly 200 miles from its last known trajectory. The news broke like a fever, spreading first through the families who had never stopped waiting, then to the world that had long forgotten. The first images from the remotely operated vehicle were grainy and blue, showing a twisted fuselage, a wing sheared off, the elegant logo of the Vance Corporation barely visible under a blanket of marine life. It was real. After all this time, it was real. Detective Miller, retired for 6 years, got the call at his home in Florida. The voice on the other end was young, a detective from a new generation, but the case was old. Miller's case. He had been the lead investigator back in 1998, the one who had to tell 5 of the country's wealthiest families that their children were gone. He had mapped the flight path, interviewed the ground crew, chased down 100 dead-end leads until the trail went cold and the file was moved from his desk to a dusty archive box labeled unsolved. He had carried that failure with him into retirement. Now it had surfaced. They wanted him back. As a consultant, Miller didn't hesitate. He packed a small bag, his mind already back in that humid summer of '98, seeing the faces of the 5 teenagers. They were called the Golden Five in the press. Julian Vance, the handsome heir to a global shipping empire. His girlfriend, Amelia, a senator's daughter. The twin brothers, Mark and David, whose father owned a media conglomerate. And the quiet one, Maya, the daughter of a tech pioneer, the one who always seemed to be watching from the edge of the frame. They were flying from New York to a private island in the Bahamas for a graduation party. They never arrived. No distress call, no debris. They just disappeared from radar. Miller remembered Eleanor Vance, Julian's mother, a woman of immense power and wealth reduced to a shell of grief. She had funded private searches for years, long after the official one was called off. She refused to believe they were gone. She called Miller every year on the anniversary of the disappearance, her voice always the same, a brittle whisper asking if there was anything new. He always had to say no. Now, finally, he could say yes. But what would the answer be? The recovery operation was slow and painstaking. A deep-sea salvage team was contracted. Their massive ship, a stark industrial presence over the turquoise water. For days, the world watched as they worked to bring the jet to the surface. It was a tomb. The first reports from the divers were grim. They had found skeletal remains, 5 of them, still strapped into the plush leather seats in the main cabin. The detail was grotesque, a surreal image of order within chaos. They had died in their seats, waiting for an impact that must have come like a thunderclap from a clear sky. The media frenzy was immense, but Miller and the investigative team worked in a bubble. They had the wreckage transported to a secure hangar at a naval base. The twisted metal was laid out on the floor like the bones of some prehistoric creature. Every piece was a clue. The engines showed no signs of a catastrophic mechanical failure. The wings had no evidence of an explosion. It was confusing. It didn't look like a high-speed, out-of-control crash. Some experts suggested it was more like a controlled ditching, an attempt to land the plane on the water. But if that was true, why was there no distress call? Why were they so far off course? And why did no one get out? In the corner of the hangar, under a harsh work light, 2 technicians worked on a small, fire-damaged orange box, the cockpit voice recorder, the black box. It was their only hope of hearing the final moments of Flight 77. Everyone knew that whatever was on that tape would be the end of the story, or the beginning of a much darker one. Eleanor Vance stood behind a police cordon at the edge of the naval base, her gaze fixed on the hangar doors. She was older now, her face a mask of sculpted grief, but her eyes were the same. They burned with a cold fire, an unyielding demand for truth. She had flown in on her own jet, the same model as the one they had just pulled from the ocean. The other families were there too, huddled together in a nearby hotel, speaking to the press through lawyers and spokespeople. But Eleanor stood alone. She had always been alone in her certainty. The others had, over the years, accepted their loss. They had held memorials, created foundations in their children's names, and tried to move on. Eleanor had not. She had maintained Julian's room just as he had left it. She had kept his car in the garage. For 12 years, she had lived as if he were simply on a long trip and might walk through the door at any moment. The discovery of the plane was both a vindication and a nightmare. It proved she was right to never give up hope of an answer, but it also meant she had to finally face the reality of his death. Miller found her there, watching the hangar. He looked older, too. The years had softened his sharp features, but not the intensity in his eyes. He approached her slowly. He didn't offer empty comforts. He just stood beside her. She didn't look at him. She just said, "You found them." Her voice was flat, empty of emotion. "Yes," he said, "we did." She was silent for a long time. Then she asked, Did they suffer? It was the question every parent was asking, the one that haunted their sleep. Miller wished he had an answer. "The evidence is contradictory," he said honestly. "The way they were found, in their seats, it suggests it was very fast. But the location, the condition of the plane, it doesn't add up. Something happened on that flight, something we don't understand yet." He didn't tell her about the theory of a controlled ditching. He didn't want to plant a seed of hope that they might have survived the initial impact, only to perish in the water. He didn't tell her that one of the seats in the main cabin, Maya's seat, was empty. The skeleton identified as hers was found in a different part of the cabin, near the galley, not strapped in. It was a detail that bothered him deeply. It broke the pattern. While the families waited, the investigation focused on the wreckage. Every piece of twisted metal told a story. The landing gear was down. That was the first major anomaly. You don't lower the landing gear for a water landing. It would act like a scoop, ripping the plane apart upon impact. It was protocol for an emergency landing on a runway, not the ocean. It was a pilot error of such a basic, catastrophic nature that it seemed impossible for two experienced aviators, unless they weren't the ones flying the plane, or unless they thought they were approaching land. Inside the cabin, personal effects were carefully cataloged. A half-finished book, a silver bracelet with Amelia's initials, a leather-bound journal belonging to Julian, its pages fused into a solid block by salt water. They pried it open carefully in the lab, hoping for a final message, but the ink had bled into illegible blue clouds. It was another dead end. The frustration in the hangar was thick enough to taste. The physical evidence was a mess of contradictions. It pointed to a dozen different scenarios, none of which made complete sense. Everything, every hope, now rested on the black box. The technicians had been working on it for 72 hours straight. The saltwater corrosion was severe. They had to rebuild parts of the reader mechanism just to attempt a playback. Finally, the call came. They had something. Miller and a small team gathered in a soundproofed room. The air was cold, sterile. The lead technician looked at them, his face pale with exhaustion. "The tape is damaged," he warned. "There's a lot of static, a lot of degradation, but there's audio." He pressed a button. The sound of a quiet hum filled the room. The first few minutes of the recording were exactly what they expected. The calm, professional voices of the two pilots, Captain Davis and his co-pilot, Richards, going through their pre-flight checks. Their chatter was routine, almost boring. In the background, coming from the cabin microphone, they could hear the faint sounds of the teenagers, laughter, the clink of glasses. Someone was playing music. It was the sound of 5 young people at the top of the world, without a care, flying off to a party on a private jet. It was haunting. Miller closed his eyes, picturing them. Julian, probably holding court, telling some grand story. Amelia laughing at his jokes. The twins, Mark and David, likely goading each other into some stupid bet. And Maya. What was Maya doing? Was she listening to the music? Was she reading? Was she just watching them all, as she always did? The flight continued normally for about an hour. The pilots discussed weather patterns far to the south. They talked about their families. Then, the cabin microphone picked up a brief exchange. It was Julian's voice, clear and confident. He said, "Just tell me when we're close. I want to see it from the air." A moment later, one of the twins, they couldn't tell which, yelled, "Last one in the water is a rotten egg!" There was more laughter. Then, for a long time, there was only the steady drone of the engines. Miller and his team listened, their bodies tense. They knew what was coming. They just didn't know when or how. About 90 minutes into the flight, the routine chatter in the cockpit stopped. There was a strange sound, a soft electronic beep. It wasn't one of the plane's standard alerts. Captain Davis said, "What was that?" The co-pilot responded, "I don't know. Not one of ours." Another beep, this one louder. A synthesized female voice, cold and robotic, said, "System override engaged." The pilots were confused. "Override of what?" Richards asked. "I didn't input anything." His voice was tight with sudden anxiety. On the tape, you could hear the frantic clicking of switches. The captain's voice was strained. "I've lost control of the throttle. The autopilot is disengaged, but it's not responding to manual input." The background drone of the engines began to change, lowering in pitch. They were losing power. Panic started to creep into their voices. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Captain Davis said, his voice clipped. "This is Gulfstream November 77 Victor Charlie. We have a flight control malfunction. We are..." He was cut off by a loud blaring alarm. It wasn't the stall warning. It wasn't the engine fire alarm. It was a piercing, unfamiliar siren that seemed to come from everywhere at once. In the background, the sounds from the cabin had stopped. The music was gone. The laughter was gone. There was only the alarm. And then, something else. Under the wall of noise, another sound started to emerge. It was faint, buried in the static and the wail of the siren. At first, they thought it was just noise from the damaged tape. But it was rhythmic. It was consistent. The lead technician leaned forward, adjusting the filters on his console. He isolated the frequency, stripping away layers of noise. He played it back. The room was utterly silent, everyone holding their breath. The sound was a whisper, a human voice. It was speaking, very close to one of the cockpit microphones. And it was repeating the same thing over and over again. The audio engineer worked for hours, painstakingly cleaning the tiny fragment of sound. He layered filters, canceled out the high-pitched scream of the alarm, and boosted the vocal frequencies. The whisper was low and breathy, almost devoid of emotion. It was impossible to tell if it was male or female. It was just a voice, a ghost on the tape, speaking from the heart of a disaster. Finally, the engineer isolated it. He played the cleaned-up audio for Miller and the team. The whisper was now clear. It was a string of numbers: 14, 22, 68, -74, 51, 30. Over and over again, the same sequence. 14, 22, 68. Negative 74, 51, 30. It was a set of coordinates. Miller felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't a prayer. It was information. Precise, calculated information, being delivered calmly in the middle of a fatal dive. The pilots were screaming now. They were fighting a dead plane. You could hear their grunts of effort, their shouted commands to each other, their sheer animal terror as the sea rushed up to meet them. And underneath it all, the whisper continued, steady and relentless, until the final deafening roar of impact. The tape ended in a blast of static. The room was silent for a full minute. No one moved. No one breathed. They had just listened to 5 people die. Miller was the first to speak. His voice was hoarse. "Play the whisper again." The engineer played the isolated vocal track. 14, 22, 68. Negative 74, 51, 30. "Whose voice is it?" Miller asked. The engineer shook his head. "Can't tell. It's too close to the mic. Too much breath. It could be anyone. And it sounds distorted. Maybe intentionally." They ran the coordinates. The numbers punched into the system brought up a map on the large screen in the room. A blinking red dot appeared in the middle of a vast, empty stretch of the Atlantic Ocean. It was nowhere near the planned flight path to the Bahamas. It was also hundreds of miles away from where the wreckage was actually found. The location was a tiny, unnamed volcanic island, a barren rock, officially uninhabited, with no airstrip, no structures, nothing. It was a place that had no reason to exist in the context of this flight. Why would they be flying there? Why would someone be whispering its coordinates as the plane went down? The theory of a simple crash was dead. The theory of a controlled ditching gone wrong was dead. This was something else. This was a hijacking, or worse. Miller looked at the red dot on the map. It felt like a destination. It felt intentional. The whispered coordinates weren't a random cry. They were a message. But for whom? And what did it mean? The investigation, which had been winding down towards a tragic but simple conclusion, was now blown wide open. The old rumors from 12 years ago came flooding back. The whispers of bitter inheritance, disputes between the families. The talk of fierce rivalries hidden behind the smiles at charity galas. Had one of the powerful families arranged this? Had they hired someone to eliminate an heir? It seemed like something out of a movie, but in their world of unimaginable wealth and power, it wasn't impossible. Miller felt a surge of cold anger. These kids weren't just victims of an accident. They were pawns in a game he didn't yet understand. He had to know who was whispering. He had the team run a vocal analysis, comparing the whisper to the known voices of the pilots and all 5 teenagers, using old news clips and home videos for samples. The results came back inconclusive. The voice on the tape was a ghost. It matched no one. This meant one of 2 things. Either the voice was so distorted by the whisper and the recording quality that it was unrecognizable, or there was a 6th person on the plane, a person who wasn't on the passenger, manifest, a stowaway, a hijacker, an assassin. The team went back to the evidence from the wreckage, looking for anything they might have missed. A footprint that didn't match, a stray fiber, anything to suggest an unknown presence. They found nothing. Miller was stuck. He had the beginning of the story, the flight. He had the end, the crash. And now he had a single, impossible clue from the middle, a voice from the grave pointing to a desolate rock in the middle of the sea. The news of the cockpit recording was carefully contained, but whispers leaked out. The families, already fractured by years of suspicion, began to turn on each other again. Lawyers were called. Accusations that had been buried for a decade were unearthed. The Vances suspected the twins' father, a ruthless media mogul who saw Julian as a future business rival. The twins' family, in turn, pointed a finger at the senator Amelia's father, whose political career had been dogged by quiet scandals. It was a viper's nest of wealth and paranoia. Miller ignored it all. The answer wasn't in their boardrooms or their country clubs. It was in the voice. It was on that island. He convinced the NTSB to fund a small expedition. A Coast Guard cutter was dispatched to the coordinates from the tape. Miller went with them. He needed to see it for himself. For 2 days, they sailed through empty ocean. On the third morning, a shape appeared on the horizon. It was just as the map had shown. A small black rock rising from the sea, its shores battered by constant waves. It was maybe a mile long, half a mile wide. There was no beach, only sheer volcanic cliffs. Landing was impossible. They circled the island for hours. From the deck of the ship, Miller scanned the cliffs with high-powered binoculars. There was no sign of life, no vegetation except for some hardy moss, no sign that anyone had ever been there. It was a dead end. He felt a familiar wave of frustration wash over him. Was this all just a final, meaningless piece of data from a dying machine? A glitch in the system? As the ship made its final pass along the western shore, a glint of light caught Miller's eye. It was high up, near the island's flat-topped summit. It wasn't natural. It was a reflection. A piece of metal, maybe, or glass. He pointed. Up there. See it? The crew focused their own binoculars. They saw it too. A small, unnatural flicker in the afternoon sun. There was no way to get to it by sea. The cliffs were too steep. They called in a helicopter. The next day, Miller was lowered from the helicopter onto the island's rocky summit. The wind was fierce, trying to tear him from the cable. He landed hard on the black, uneven ground. The air was cold and smelled of salt and bird droppings. He unhooked himself, and the helicopter pulled away, its thumping blades fading into the roar of the wind. He was alone on the island. He made his way carefully towards the spot where they had seen the reflection. The ground was treacherous, covered in loose, sharp rock. And then he saw it. It was a small pile of stones, a cairn, clearly man-made. On top of the pile sat a small, weatherproof pelican case. It was latched shut. Tucked under the lid was a single laminated photograph. Miller's heart hammered against his ribs. He picked it up. The photo was of the Golden Five. They were standing on an airport tarmac, squinting in the sun, their arms around each other. They were smiling. Behind them was the Gulfstream jet, the one now sitting in pieces in a hangar. It was a picture taken just moments before they boarded their final flight. He turned the photo over. On the back, written in black marker, were 2 words, "Forgive us." Miller stared at the words, then at the case. This wasn't a hijacker's message. This wasn't a ransom note. This felt like a confession, or a final statement. He knelt down and unlatched the case. Inside, protected from the elements, was a satellite phone and a small leather-bound notebook. It was not Julian's waterlogged journal. This one was perfectly preserved. He opened it. The first page had a single sentence, written in neat, precise handwriting. The handwriting of a planner, an architect. The sentence read, "Project Nightingale is a success." Miller sat on the cold volcanic rock, the wind whipping around him, and read the notebook. It was a manifesto. A detailed step-by-step plan for the 5 teenagers to fake their own deaths, escape their families, and disappear forever. It was all there. The Nightingale Project, as they called it, was meticulously planned over a year. It was born out of a shared sense of being trapped. They weren't just rich kids. They were assets, legacies, prisoners of the gilded cages their parents had built for them. Julian was being forced into a role he despised, destined to run his father's empire, when all he wanted was to be a writer. Amelia was being groomed for a political marriage to secure her father's dynasty. The twins were treated as a single entity, their futures mapped out for them without their consent. And Maya, the quiet one, the genius, she was the architect. The notebook was in her handwriting. She was the one who saw a way out. She had used her skills to siphon millions of dollars from her father's company, converting it into untraceable cryptocurrency. She had researched uninhabited islands, escape routes, and new identities. The plan was audacious. She had designed a device that would interface with the jet's fly-by-wire system. It would trigger a fake emergency, allowing them to broadcast a Mayday call before she took control of the plane remotely from a laptop in the cabin. The system override engaged voice was her. The strange alarm was hers. It was all a show for the black box. The plan was to put the jet into a controlled glide, fly it far off course to this specific island, and then ditch it in the deep ocean trench nearby. They had life rafts, survival gear, and supplies. The small pile of rocks, the Pelican case with the satellite phone, it was a pre-placed cache, a beacon for their new life. They would wait on the island for a few weeks until the search was called off, then use the sat phone to contact a prepaid transport to take them to a new country, a new life, with new names. It was brilliant. It was desperate. And it had gone horribly, catastrophically wrong. Miller flipped through the pages. He saw diagrams of the jet's wiring, lists of supplies, timelines. It was the work of a meticulous, desperate mind. Maya had thought of everything, except for one thing. On the last written page of the notebook, the plan ended. The next page was blank. Miller sat there, the empty pages flapping in the wind. The plan was perfect. So what happened? Why was the wreckage found hundreds of miles from here? Why were their bodies still in their seats? The answer had to be on the tape. He had to go back and listen again, knowing what he knew now. He radioed for the helicopter. As he was being lifted off the island, he looked down at the small pile of rocks, the monument to a dream of freedom that had become a tombstone. When he got back to the base, he went straight to the audio lab. He told the engineer to play the full recording again. This time, he wasn't listening for a hijacker. He was listening for Maya. He heard the start of the plan, the fake alarm, the pilot's confusion, and then he heard the whisper. 14, 22, 68. It was Maya, speaking the coordinates of the island into the cockpit microphone, creating a false trail for anyone who might find the black box. She was in the cockpit. That explained her empty seat. She had likely gone forward under the pretense of getting a drink, then initiated her program. But as he listened, he heard something he'd missed before. In the final seconds of the tape, buried under the pilot's screams and the roar of the ocean, there was another sound. It wasn't part of the plan. It was the sound of a struggle. Miller had the technicians isolate the last 30 seconds of the recording, filtering out everything but the cabin and cockpit microphones. The chaos was overwhelming. The pilots were shouting about a complete hydraulic failure. The plane was in a nosedive, and they couldn't pull up. The sheer G-forces must have been pinning everyone to their seats. But in the cockpit, something else was happening. They could hear a thud, a grunt of effort, and then a voice, strained and full of rage. It was Julian. He was shouting, "What did you do?" "What did you do, Maya?" There was the sound of a scuffle, a desperate fight for the controls. Maya's voice, no longer a calm whisper, but a panicked cry. It was supposed to work. "I don't know what's wrong." The plane wasn't in a controlled glide. It was falling out of the sky, Her program, her brilliant escape plan had a flaw. Maybe a bug in the code, or an unexpected hardware incompatibility. Instead of giving her control, it had severed the pilot's connection to the flight surfaces completely. It had turned the jet into a multi-ton glider with no way to steer. They weren't flying to the island, they were crashing. And Maya, the architect of their escape, was trapped in the cockpit with a furious Julian Vance, watching her dream turn into a mass murder-suicide. Amelia's voice was on the tape then, screaming from the cabin. "Julian, stop! Just let her fix it!" But there was nothing to fix. They were out of time and out of sky. The last sound from the cockpit, just before the final impact, wasn't Julian's rage or the pilot's terror. It was a single, tiny sound from Maya. A gasp. A sound of utter, horrified realization. It was the sound of a 16-year-old girl understanding that she had just killed all of her friends. Miller sat back, the silence in the room deafening. The mystery was solved. There was no hijacker, no corporate espionage, no sixth person. There was only a group of desperate children, led by a brilliant, broken girl whose plan for freedom had a fatal flaw. They hadn't been murdered by their parents' world. They had died trying to escape it. The landing gear being down, the one detail that made no sense was suddenly clear. In the final chaotic moments, one of the pilots, in a last, desperate act of muscle memory, must have reached for the landing gear lever, his brain defaulting to the procedure for an emergency landing on solid ground. It was a final, futile gesture in the face of an impossible situation. The truth was so much simpler and so much more tragic than any of the conspiracy theories. It was a story of teenage angst and hubris, magnified by wealth and genius, and ending in a way no one could have predicted. Miller had to deliver this truth to the families. He met them not as a group, but one by one. He started with Eleanor Vance. He sat with her in the sterile quiet of a hotel conference room and laid out the story, piece by piece. He showed her the photograph from the island. He read her excerpts from Maya's journal. He told her about Julian's last words. He watched as 12 years of hardened hope finally crumbled. Her son hadn't been taken from her by a rival. He had willingly walked into a plan concocted by a friend, a plan to leave her forever. His final moments were not of quiet acceptance, but of violent, betrayed rage. Which was worse? A random act of violence, or a death born from a desire to never see her again? She didn't cry. She just sat there, her perfect composure finally cracking, revealing the hollowed-out woman beneath. She finally understood that her son's cage, the one she had lovingly gilded for him, was the thing that had killed him. She thanked Miller, her voice a dry rasp, and walked out of the room. He knew he would never hear from her again. The story of the Golden Five became a cautionary tale, a modern Icarus myth for the 21st century. The media reported the official findings: a catastrophic flight control failure, initiated by a device brought on board by one of the passengers. The salacious details from Maya's journal were sealed, out of respect for the families, but the truth lingered. The story of their planned escape, their dream of a new life, became a legend whispered in the circles they once inhabited. The world saw them not as victims of a crime, but as architects of their own tragic fate. For Maya's family, the shame was unbearable. Her father, the tech pioneer, retreated from public life. His company eventually sold off in pieces. He had given his daughter every tool to succeed in his world, and she had used them to try and burn it all down. The other families found their own ways to cope. They created charities for troubled teens, funded scholarships, and spoke at conferences about the pressures faced by young people. They channeled their grief into action, trying to prevent another story like theirs from ever happening. But for them, the questions would never truly end. Was their child a willing participant? A reluctant follower? A victim of peer pressure? The notebook and the tape gave them the what, but not the why for each individual soul. The final moments were too chaotic, too filled with panic, to reveal the truth of each heart. They were left to wonder forever if their child had died full of hope for a new beginning, or full of terror at a plan gone wrong. Detective Miller officially closed the case. He returned to his quiet life in Florida, but the ghosts of Flight 77 never fully left him. He would sometimes sit on his porch, looking out at the water, and think about that barren rock in the Atlantic. He thought about the care with which Maya had placed that pelican case, the hope contained within it. He thought about her handwriting in the notebook, so neat and certain, laying out a future that would never come. He often wondered about that final gasp on the tape. Was it a sound of fear, of regret, or was it something else? Was it the sound of a soul realizing that even in her most brilliant attempt to control her destiny, to escape the pull of her life, she had only managed to steer it more quickly, more violently? To its inevitable end? He had the coordinates memorized. 14, 22, 68, -74, 51, 30. Sometimes, late at night, he would pull them up on a map on his computer, staring at the red dot in the middle of the ocean. It was a ghost on the map, a memorial to 5 kids who had everything and nothing at the same time. It was the destination they never reached, the beginning of a life they never got to live. It was the place where their hope was stored, preserved in a waterproof case, waiting forever for people who were never going to arrive. A dream of escape, sitting alone on a rock, surrounded by an endless, unforgiving sea. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.